George in Arizona wants to talk about whether or not the resurrection could have happened. Welcome, George.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Pretty good.
Hello?
Yeah, yes. We can hear you. You wanted to talk about whether or not the resurrection is possible?
Yeah. So first, I just want to kind of introduce myself. I'm 15 years old. I don't know if that's relevant, but that's all I just kind of wanted to bring out for some reason. And I find it pretty cool to let's see. So I was going to ask, do you agree that Jesus existed?
I don't have any problem with the notion that he did, but that doesn't mean that I'm convinced it's a done deal that he existed. It's really hard to figure out. We talked about this kind of recently. It depends on what you mean by Jesus. Like, if you list all the things that are attributed to Jesus's life, there's pretty much none of them that we can verify. And so when some of those things include miraculous events that seem heroic and beyond what one could expect to find in reality, then it could be that we're just talking about kind of like a fictional creation. But let's just say that if you take away the miracle things and you just want to say that there was an itinerant rabbi, Yeshua ben Joseph, who possibly existed in first century Judea, I'm okay with that as a starting point.
There were probably 30 of them, by the way.
Yeah.
What about his crucifixion? Do you agree he was crucified?
No, I don't have. This is a claim, but I'll go ahead and grant for the sake of this discussion that there was someone who was killed by crucifixion that you're referencing.
So is Christ's crucifixion is historical?
Okay, no, it's not.
Even
no. So George, I'm sorry, but it's simply not a verifiable fact that Jesus either existed or was crucified. That's not a verifiable fact. It is something that is accepted, generally speaking, by historians, Christian and otherwise, but it's not something that we can demonstrate is actually true.
Okay, so Darrel Ray and Dr. Bart Ehrman all agree, atheist scholars say that Jesus did in fact crucify. What happened to him?
George.
Wait, hold on, I didn't even get to finish.
No, I know you didn't get to finish because you're not listening. As some of the two of us, which one of us knows Bart Ehrman?
Can you just please let me finish?
No. Of the two of us, which one of us knows Bart Ehrman?
I don't know Bart Ehrman. Do you?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
I've moderated a debate with Bart. Here's the thing. Instead of citing what somebody says, because Bart Ehrman and I have talked about this, and I've been there when he's done a debate on the historicity thing. He thinks Jesus was historical. The fact that there are people who can disagree on this, there's no evidence that Bart or anyone else can point to say, here you go. Here's exactly how we know that Jesus existed and was crucified. But if you'd have listened to me, George, and I'm giving you every possible benefit of the doubt, I said that I'm fine with the notion that Jesus existed. I said I'm fine for the sake of this discussion with going that he was crucified. All I'm saying is that you have no way to demonstrate that actually happened. But I did note that historians, both Christian and non-Christian, generally accept that this is what likely happened. Why is that a problem for you?
Okay, I agree with that, but do you agree with that he was crucified?
No. I agree that George, stop.
Okay. Let me see real quick.
George, stop.
Believe that you didn't even
George, stop. Because you don't get to just move on. I want to make sure we're on the same page. Otherwise, it becomes a waste of time. I am fine with the notion that most historians accept that Jesus existed and was crucified. Then you asked me if I personally think that Jesus was crucified, and I am not convinced that he was crucified or that he existed, but I'm fine with the notion. I want to make sure we understand that.
We do now. Okay.
Okay. What's the question then?
Crucified. What would convince you that he was crucified?
Evidence.
Okay, so most of the sources that say Jesus did live are the same sources that say he was crucified. So what sources do you get that Jesus was alive since you believe that? What are your sources for him being alive?
Boy, you're just not listening, George. I told you I neither believe that Jesus was alive nor that he was crucified because there isn't sufficient evidence for it, but I am fine with the notion that historians accept those things and I'm fine with accepting them for the sake of argument. Don't tell me that you've listened to me if you then turn around and demonstrate that you did not listen to me.
Why are you mad?
What is your question?
My question was, so you don't have a problem with them believing that Jesus existed. Is that what you're saying?
Wow, I don't know why you keep paraphrasing this. I personally am not convinced, but I am aware that most historians are convinced.
Okay. So you're on that. So you want evidence. What evidence is convincing to you?
Of what? What's the claim?
Of Jesus being crucified. What evidence would convince you?
Show me some actual record that shows that the specific person you're talking about was recorded historically as having been executed by crucifixion.
Okay, the Gospel of Matthew.
No, so those aren't historical documents. They're not eyewitness accounts, and we have no idea who wrote them. You can't use anonymous sources that were written decades after the facts. That's not how we do things.
Prove that they were anonymous. Prove that they were anonymous.
Okay.
George, you are aware that we legitimately don't know who wrote those books. And we also know that they were written 30 to 40 years after.
Stop. George, do you know what this is I'm holding in my hand?
You're holding you're going to quote the Bible. I'm pretty sure you're going to quote the Bible where it says the same thing. But there's atheist scholars who also say that that the Gospels do bear record of Matthew. For example,
George, if you would shut the fuck up, you little runt, and listen to me and stop presuming what I'm going to say. What I asked you was, what am I holding in my hand? A Bible, right?
Yes, that's what I just said.
Do you know what it says in this Bible right here at the beginning of the book of Matthew?
That Matthew was anonymous.
Correct. Now, if Bibles and Christian scholars show it's not the Bible that says Matthew is anonymous, because that section at the beginning of the book of Matthew is not part of the Bible. That's commentary from Christian scholars. If you go out to any Christian scholar source, earlychristianwritings.com, hell, Wikipedia, the authorship of Matthew is unknown.
Okay, so is that why you believe that it's anonymous?
That's what anonymous means, George.
Is that why you believe it was written anonymously? Because all the scholars agree.
Yes. No, hang on, George. When you say it wasn't, I'm not saying it was. George, stop, George. First of all, I'll retract the runt thing. That was mean. But you need to listen and stop pretending that you're listening, because you keep coming back to paraphrasing. It wasn't written anonymously. The point is, it is anonymous now. We do not know who the author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are.
Okay. That's your claim?
That's a fact.
Okay.
Even your own scholars believe that or know that.
And your own scholars know that Jesus exists and he was crucified. Vice versa.
George, let me explain a logical fallacy to you, okay? If I say the sky is blue and I say I have angels living in my ass, I've now said two things. Does that mean they're both true?
The sky is blue and no. Well, that's two different stories.
Correct. And George, stop. It's also two different stories about whether or not a book has a known author and whether or not the subject actually existed. Those are two separate facts. You are committing a fallacy that because I'm willing to accept an historical source on one point, that I should then accept that historical source on other points. And that is a fallacy. That is not a sound argument.
Okay. So what evidence do scholars use to prove that the Gospels are anonymous? What evidence do they have for that? Besides
the fact that there are no copies that are signed autographs. None.
So they don't have their names on it because they don't have their names on it? Is that what you're kind of saying?
George, you realize that these things were written and that quite often people signed them, like the letters from Paul were signed by Paul, and we can tell which letters were actually written by Paul and which ones were forgeries. and that when it comes to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have no copies that bear the name of an author. That's what anonymous means.
Okay. So I see the manuscript. So gospel according to Matthew.
No, sir, you don't see a manuscript. There's no manuscripts for these.
Okay, there's no manuscript. Papyrus 4 is not a manuscript for the gospel according to Matthew?
Manuscript applies to the original. What you are seeing is copies of translations of copies, but there is no signed copy of any of the gospels.
Okay, what I'm saying though is that the manuscript, most of the manuscripts say according to Matthew or gospel according to Matthew.
Yes, but that's what, okay. You need to go do some research, George, because I don't have time to teach you everything that you don't know about this subject. But Christian scholars, including, this is why I pulled up the Bible at the beginning of a part of this. It's actually written in the Bible by Christian scholars to say that we do not have autographs, we do not have manuscripts, we don't know who wrote it, and that it is church tradition to attribute this gospel to Matthew, this gospel to Mark, this gospel to Luke, this gospel to John. But what we know is they weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So just because they don't say who wrote it, that doesn't mean we can't find out who we know. That's just like saying if I put "hi" on the trash can and I don't know, and we don't know who wrote it, and I don't say who wrote.
Correct, George. Prove that they were written by the people whose names are on there, and you will get a Nobel fucking prize. And you will be lauded as the greatest Christian scholar of all time, because the people who've spent their lives trying to do exactly that have failed to do it. So stop pretending that you're on some firmer ground than the scholars you'd like to quote.
Have you read Bart Ehrman yet? Have you actually read any of his books?
I'll answer that question after I make a question I was about to ask.
No, actually, you won't. You'll answer Dr. Ray's question, or you don't get to talk anymore.
I was talking first, though. That's not fair.
Oh, it's not fair. Goodbye.
Okay, but whatever. No, I haven't read it.
Okay. That's
now,
all I need
now, what
to
was
know.
your question?
Okay. Thank you. So, basically, I was gonna ask on the so basically the manuscripts, though. You're saying that scholars say that, but I'm looking at the manuscripts, and they say that according to Matthew, Papyrus 4, all these manuscripts.
I just explained this.
According to Matthew.
I just explained this.
Finish the point.
No, you don't, because you're not listening, George. That's the problem. You're going after something that I already explained to you.
Okay. So with all these manuscripts agreeing on according to Matthew, we can be sure that's what the original said.
George,
according to Matthew was not in the original. That is something that exists in those scripts. I'm sorry that you haven't bothered to do your homework. Maybe you should go start doing that.
But if we don't have the originals, then how are we know we're supposed to say without comparing the manuscripts?
Because I don't write a letter to someone and say, according to Matthew. That's added by someone after. I don't write letters that say, according to Matthew. Nobody does. That's not the way shit works. I'm sorry that this is difficult, but there are answers to this. You are calling in to quiz an atheist show when the answers to your questions, which you would benefit from greatly, even as a believer, to go study what the Christian scholars have said, because I'm not the one who's sitting here disagreeing with Christian scholars. You are.
Okay, so you shouldn't be disagreeing with your atheist scholars about Jesus or the crucifixion at all either then.
And that's a fallacy, as I explained to you about 5 minutes ago. The fact that some scholar says one thing doesn't mean that they're right about a different thing.
Virtually every scholar says. So what? So that means if you don't believe it, you can't. You do not have the right, or you can do it. But I'm saying you should. If you do not know for sure if it doesn't exist, you can't say it doesn't exist.
I didn't say it doesn't exist, George. Now you're making yet another mistake. You're so tied up in knots and so desperate to show that we're somehow being unreasonable that you are the one who's being unreasonable at every turn. It is a fallacy to say that because you accept an historical authority on one subject that you should accept them on others. It is a fallacy on your part to suggest that if I can't disprove it, that therefore I shouldn't believe it, or I don't have a reason to not believe it. These are all logical fallacies. I am not convinced that God exists. I am not convinced that the Bible is true. I'm not convinced that Jesus existed. And the historians that I'm pointing to, there are scholars about language who are looking at this to say, was this written by Matthew? Was this written in this time frame? Those scholars are not the same as the ones that are determining whether or not Jesus existed as an historical figure. It is a tenet, essentially, of his historical protocols, that if someone is written about as if they actually existed, that we just by default assume they existed. The problem is that while that works for most people, it doesn't work for mythical figures, which is why you have the George Washington and the cherry tree story. It's why you have stories about Paul Bunyan and King Arthur that aren't true, even though these people are spoken about as if they were real people. So it's not a problem for me to say I'm willing to accept that this book that we don't know the author to, because that's a fact that is within the realm of literature historian, and yet I'm not willing to believe that the character in the literature is someone who actually existed, because that's no longer literature historian. That is something else.
Okay, so with all that in mind, so since I'm not saying you, I'm saying so since majority of scholars and historians agree that Jesus exists, what sources do they use to prove that? Because they must be getting this belief based on some type of sources. So what sources do you know that Bart Ehrman uses?
George, you didn't listen to me again. I literally just the couple of sentences right before you asked that question, answer that question. It is essentially a tenet of historical process that if someone is spoken about as having been an actual person, that you begin by assuming that they're an actual person. You're asking me, what evidence do they have that he was a real person? I'm telling you, they don't have any. This is a default assumption that because someone was written about as if they were a real person, that we give them the benefit of the doubt and that person just existed. I answered your question literally a moment before you asked it, and you're not listening, George, and that's why you're making a mess.
You think you say that to everybody or just me, though?
I'm sorry, what?
Every time. Like, I'm serious. You say that to everybody. I'm not even kidding. You're always saying that to every single person. This is why they call you the Dillahunty Dodge. George,
I answered your question a moment before you asked it. Do you know how silly you look suggesting that I dodged your question when I answered it right before you asked it?
I'm not saying you dodged it. I'm saying, though, you do this to everybody. You always call somebody not listening. You tell everybody that that's not a...
George, if I answered your question before you asked it, and you immediately asked the question that I had just answered, and you've done it multiple times, what difference does it make if I pointed that out to other people? The fact is, you are doing it.
I'm dodging your question.
You're not listening.
Okay. I'll let you explain your point, and then I'm gonna listen. And then when I have a question, and if I don't get it right, then I won't talk no more. If I'm not listening, you can. Oh,
are we making deals? Here's the thing, George. You weren't listening, because what would you say if you over the course of 3 sentences explain something to someone, and then they immediately asked you the question that was answered by what you had just said? What would you say to them?
I don't know. I haven't been in a situation like that. But on top of that, though, it's the same. It's kind of weird how the church fathers and the church fathers attributed the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew, and then the Gospel of Matthew talks about money more than any other gospel, because Matthew was a tax collector. So I think it's kind of weird to say Matthew did not write the Gospel of Matthew.
Well, then you need to take it up with the actual scholars who say that the Gospel of Matthew is anonymous and almost certainly wasn't written by Matthew, the tax collector. You need to take that up with the Christian scholars. And in order to do that, you're going to have to come up with more than just your suspicion. You need evidence.
Okay.
George, there's a lot to learn here. You're 15 and you can get out there and start doing some really interesting research. When I was about your age, I started learning about the synoptic gospels, and I had no clue about what that meant until I got in and researched it. I'm not going to explain to you what it is now, but let's just say So what I'm going to suggest is to it sounds to me like you've read a lot of Christian apologists. So there's more to this world than what Christians say. There's more than what Muslims say or Hindus say. So you need to start thinking about how you're going to do your research, and then, come back and share some of your research. Because I'm guaranteeing some of the things you're saying now are so well known, and yet you're disputing them. They're like been around for 100 years. We've known none of these things are written by the people whose names are right on those gospels.
And in keeping with everything, not only will I retract it, but I would like to publicly apologize for calling you a little runt. That was me getting irritated at the fact that you weren't fucking listening, which you repeatedly proved.
Okay, why do you need to cuss though after saying sorry though? What's the point of getting mad after saying sorry if you're just gonna?
What's wrong with cussing after I say sorry, before I say sorry, or whenever the fuck I want?
Ignore the fucking effing, and just why do you have to get? What's the point of getting mad?
I'm not mad. Why do you think I'm mad just because I use the word fuck?
Everybody says you're mad.
Okay, does that make it true? Because what is your objection to me saying fuck?
I'm yelling at you.
I didn't yell at you.
I didn't really want.
You're objecting to me using the word fuck, and I'd like to know why.
You were yelling at Anthony. I remember. You're being mean to him.
Okay. Oh, I'm being mean. Okay. Why won't you answer the question about what's wrong with using the word fuck?
Okay, what I just found wrong with it is not that I usually found it wrong. It's just that usually when somebody says a cuss word and then start yelling like that, it kind of shows they're mad. That's your answer right there.
Okay, I'm trying to get you to set aside your baggage that's allowing you to bias things and actually ask you. You said, why would I say fuck after apologizing? Why wouldn't I?
Okay, that's what I just answered you. You're not.
No, you didn't. You said that usually people interpret that as mad. I'm asking you, why would I not say the word fuck after apologizing?
I'm just asking, because what I answer your question is that it's kind of weird for
George, you're not going to answer my question. That's very clear. So we're going to move on.